Baby boomer and Gen X parents, this one is for you. Do you have a millennial family member? Are your Christian faith and values being effectively instilled in your kids? The latest installment in my colleague George Barna's polling suggests that many Christian parents may not be as effective as they had hoped. George, welcome back to the program.
Thanks, Joseph. Always good to be with you.
Well, it's great to have you. An important topic as always. First off, tell us what your survey found about the religious identity of most millennials.
Well, interestingly, we found that about 2 out of 3 of them, literally 65%, called themselves Christian. We found, however, that the second largest and really the only other significant block of millennials are those who have no faith tradition at all. They don't relate to Christianity. They don't relate to Eastern faiths. They don't relate to Islam. They don't relate to anything else. And so you have just a handful of people who would say that they associate with Judaism, Mormonism, any of the Eastern faiths and so forth. However, I think, Joseph, it's important that we keep in mind that when we say they're calling themselves Christian, we also discovered through the survey that when they use the term Christian, they probably mean something different than you and I might. What we found is that to them, Christian is a generic term. All it means to them is that I'm a good person. It doesn't even mean that they're a religious person. It just means that they try to do what they think is right. And so it's become a generic term, kind of like Kleenex or Xerox. Now it simply means, yeah, I'm good.
That's interesting, and that's actually something I did want to ask you about because of this apparent rejection of the fundamental claims of Christianity while maintaining the term, the label. Why is it that they're not just walking away and saying, I'm just a good person, but I'm not a Christian? It's because I don't believe Christian things.
Well, they're not. They are in many ways walking away. When we looked at their behavior, for instance, what we found is that they're probably about a third less likely than older Americans to actually participate in many of the common Christian activities, whether that's attending church, reading the Bible, donating money to a religious center, volunteering to help for religious purposes. All of those numbers are lower, which is kind of interesting because we also found that as a generation, they're much more activist than any group we've seen, at least in the last 40 years. So faith is not as big a deal to them. You know, there was another number that jumped out in the survey, and that's that 41% of millennials fit in this category of don'ts, people who don't know if God exists, don't care if God exists, or don't believe that God exists. So when you start putting all these things together, basically what they're doing is they're redefining what religion means. It's not about going to a church. It's not about participating in the life of a church. It's really not even about God or any kind of a relationship with him. They have a whole different understanding of what spirituality means.
Well, that seems to be consistent with our cultural value system where everything is personal. You know, we define ourselves in every way. We define our gender, and we define our own religion, and we can kind of make whatever suits us. But you also say, I'm going to quote you and then ask you to respond to this. The survey says that millennials do not seem to have a problem with Jesus Christ as much as they have a problem with Christian churches, Christian individuals, and some biblical principles that directly conflict with popular culture, in popular cultural perspectives. Now, how does that translate into the real world when they say, I like Jesus, I just don't like the church?
Yeah, what we found is that for the most part, they're okay with Jesus. It reminds me of the old song, Jesus is just all right with me. And that's kind of where they're coming from. But they've had a series of not very positive experiences with Christians themselves. What we heard through our survey is that for the most part, they think that Christian individuals are hypocrites because they say they believe one thing, but they live differently. They would say that, they have problems with the pastors of Christian churches. In fact, when we looked at opinions about many different types of cultural influencers, pastors didn't fare all that well. Only 26%, just one out of every four millennials, say that they always or almost always feel that they can trust pastors of Christian churches to say or do what's right. That's pretty low, one out of four. So you've got the two primary representatives that they encounter on a day-to-day basis who they really don't trust, they don't believe in, and that's really had it's made a dent in their ideas about what Christianity is.
Well, George, I am the son of a pastor, and I would say that I even relate to that in some ways. And I'm going to ask this question: is there details about why that distrust exists? Why are millennials, why are young people having issues with people that used to be just generally respected in the community?
You know, when we look at this whole shift, I think what's driving it, there are several things. One of those things is the different belief structure that they have, where when we look at millennials now, their beliefs are very different. They're not biblical in nature, which makes sense because they don't read the Bible, they don't believe in the Bible, they don't believe that it's relevant. But a second thing beyond their beliefs are their experiences. So the exchanges that they've had with individual Christians or with pastors have not brought them to a positive place of saying, yeah, Christianity really holds the answers. Christians are the kind of people I want to be with. You know, we look at some of the key issues of the day, whether it has to do with sexual identity or race relations and so forth. They don't believe that Christians have really come to grips in a realistic manner with these issues. But we also know that part of what's driving them away from Christianity is what's being modeled for them by Christians, as we talked about, you know, their compromise of Christian beliefs and hypocritical lifestyles. And also in terms of relationships, they haven't had good experiences with people who are professing Christians when it comes to being supportive and understanding in those personal relationships.
So does that suggest that there is a way to restore the trust in the church and in pastors and spiritual leaders in the institution without abandoning the fundamental tenets of Christianity?
Yeah, as we explored this a little bit, what we found was that most millennials oppose being overtly evangelized. They oppose being hit over the head with the scriptures and saying, here's the truth, take it or leave it, because they've chosen to leave it. But what we did find is that when somebody is willing to listen to them, when somebody is willing to build a long-term relationship with them, where it's not about believe what I believe or I'm leaving you, but it's about a more Socratic-oriented exchange. That is where we ask questions because we really care about the person. We're really trying to understand what they believe and why. All of those kinds of things that go into a longer term unfolding of a partnership in life, a real desire to support the other person. Now, that doesn't mean that we compromise what we believe. We have to have a clear sense of our narrative, if you will, you know, in postmodern terms, giving people a sense of what Christianity is about, why we believe it, what it looks like in our life, why we think it makes sense, but not trying to force people to believe that, giving them the option to make their own choices because they're going to anyway, but simply letting them know, you know what, this is where I'm coming from. If we can be friends, but I can't compromise what I believe. I'm not asking you to compromise what you believe, but I would ask you to consider these other ways of thinking. They've worked for me. They're working for a lot of other people. They may well work for you in certain situations. You might give it a try.
Yeah. Now, George, we know that churches are imperfect places. But we also know that because we live in a spiritual war, there are people and there are cultural forces that want to malign and misrepresent the church. Do you think millennials' concerns with organized churches are primarily the result of real problems within the church that are fixable and should be fixed? Or is there a smear campaign against the church by those who hate the church that's being effective?
Well, I think it's a combination of both, Joseph. What we found is that most millennials have had experience in and with churches. So they're not just talking out of school. I mean, they've been there, they know what they've gone through and whether or not it worked for them. On the other hand, now that most of them have made a decision to detach from a local church or some kind of a spiritual body, a community of faith, that decision is being reinforced by what you described as a smear campaign. A lot of negative comments that you would find particularly in social media, but also around the water cooler and other places in the marketplace where people go. It's common to dump on the church. And so what that's doing is that's reinforcing their decision to pull away from organized Christianity. Remember that millennials don't have positive perspectives about institutions overall. And so when they look at local churches, when they look at denominations, when they look at church-related organizations or faith-related organizations, their initial inclination is to doubt their sincerity and to doubt the positions that they're taking. So it's a difficult thing that has to be overcome. It's going to take a long time. But the only way that we're going to get there is by loving them back into God's arms.
George, another finding in your study, you say that despite a dramatic decline in belief in a transcendent sovereign God, atheism has not been widely embraced by millennials to fill that vacuum. So they're not taking this affirmative opposition, denial of the belief of God. Does that mean that are they still looking for something? Are they content, or are they wanting a home?
Yeah, great question. And one of the key things to me in answering that is to recognize that 75% of millennials tell us that they're still seeking a sense of purpose and meaning in life. Obviously, going back to Blaise Pascal's old quote about there's a God-shaped hole in each of us that only he can fill. That's what they're looking for, is the true God, the God who created them and loves them. They don't buy that ideology right now, but that's ultimately what they're searching for. So yeah, there's an opportunity for them to come back to God. Right now, they're basically saying, look, I'm just confused. I feel alone. I feel isolated. I don't know what to make of all this. I'm fearful about life. These are all the kinds of things that God can take care of. They don't realize that. So yes, there's a possibility they'll come back. They're not, most of them are not definitively saying there is not and cannot be God. Most of them are saying, I don't get it. I don't see it. I haven't experienced it, although they have and they don't know it. So that confusion is what we need to help clarify.
You also say in your survey that concern about the afterlife has been replaced by an emphasis on living in the moment and making the most of this present life. Does that mean millennials are more likely than others to be making the world a better place in practical ways?
Well, they're trying, but of course, the ways that they're trying don't have any staying power, doesn't have the endurance to really affect people's lives in the long haul. Because you can only really do that when you're operating through the power of Christ for his purposes and his kingdom. And so what we have here is a group of people who, as they're trying to be good people based on their own efforts, their own best thinking, they're finding that that's really tough slogging. It's not working well for them. They don't know what else to do, so they just keep trying different approaches. But, they're also at a point where now there's a greater openness to Eastern mysticism, where 1 out of 4 of them now have bought into ideas about their own higher consciousness that they're trying to evolve into, have bought into the idea that we're all God or that there are multiple gods. So they're still exploring. There's an opportunity here for us to help them clarify that. They're not going to find it through their own best efforts of just trying to make the world a better place. They've got to do that in partnership with the living God.
George Barna, greatly appreciate your research and your time sharing it with us. It's a call to action for all of us. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Joseph.